Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Executive Director of CCSSO, Carissa Moffett-Miller.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our afternoon session. I want to say that you are definitely the diehards because that weather out there is absolutely beautiful, and I don't know if I would be a rule follower if I weren't up on the stage today. So you obviously care deeply about what our session is about today, which is how state assessment systems can support student learning. And I want to welcome you to our session today. I want to start out just talking to you a little bit about why that we think this is important. I'm going to introduce my esteemed colleagues here in just a moment, and we're going to get into some questions. We're going to have an opportunity for you to interact with them and ask them questions. But I want to go back to where I started yesterday, really drive home the point of asking that question. And I'm just curious, show of hands, how many of you in your sessions asked yourself or asked your colleagues, how is what we're doing going to improve education for all kids? How many of you actually, thank you, Scott, Marion, I can see you right there. You still have an opportunity. So you have more sessions today and a little bit tomorrow, and you can still do that. So I want to just really drive that home about keeping that big picture in mind and how we really improve education for all kids. And I want to just give you a little bit of history, although Jim's going to give us even more history as we get into this. But I began working in this field right as No Child Left Behind was being put into action. I was at the Idaho State Board of Education at that time. It was one of the first states to deliver online testing statewide. I know Oregon claims they're first, so we'll let them have that, but it was a statewide endeavor, and it was a big deal. Because while it seems kind of commonplace today to deliver stuff online, it wasn't happening then, and it was a big move to move there. We were being able to get results back faster. We were listening to the teachers. It was an opportunity to create questions with teachers. We really felt like we were progressing in that way. Fast forward 7 years in my trajectory in my career, working at the State Department of Education under an elected superintendent, and the race to the top work on the assessment consortia. I talked yesterday a little bit about what kind of an opportunity that was. Particularly for a state like the one I was working in, where we could share good practices, share items, really leverage things that we as a state alone couldn't do. Our districts at that point had started calling for a more cohesive system. The conversation about formative was happening at that point, more meaningful tests, performance tasks, writing. They wanted to talk about growth. All those things were really coming about, and people were willing to give up some of the rapid fire results to get more meaningful information. So from my vantage point from that and then my time at CCSSO, I've only seen statewide assessment really just grow and evolve and get better for students. So, that's due in large part to you all in this room where you've just continued to try and make it a better system. I think the challenge today still remains for the connections to the reports that we put out, and then what that means for what schools will do for kids in the classroom. And I do think, at the state level, we have a responsibility for that. I think back to the times that I would go to a party or go out to an event, and I would have parents talk to me about the reports they would get for their kids. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? You can't go anywhere that someone doesn't say to you, hey, let's talk about the state test, and boy, I sure don't know why my kid's taking this, and I don't know what these results mean, and so we'd have all those kinds of conversations. And quite frankly, in my role as an assessment director, I just thought they were doing a lot of complaining. I didn't know what they meant, because I understood it and I knew what was going on. Fast forward to where I am today, where I'm in a different state, which will remain nameless. You can ask me later about that. Where I'm on the receiving end of getting those reports for my kids, and I understand them. However, I don't know what that means in the classroom. I don't know what that means for my kid. I don't know what that means for If she's at proficient, where are you going to take her from here? And if she's not at proficient, what are you going to do for her? Like, I'm not clear how that connects to the learning that's going to go on in the classroom as a parent. And I think that's a real opportunity for us today. And so we're going to have a discussion about that. We're going to talk about some of the good work going on in the states and from a vantage point of where we go from here. But I want to just really drive home that the reports that we give to parents have a real opportunity for better information. I saw that I'm really encouraged by the sessions that I'm seeing here on assessment literacy, about how to talk to legislators, how to involve stakeholders in this work. And I also think there's a real opportunity for what we do for school improvement. As we move into this era of comprehensive and targeted support, the closing of the gap for kids is not going to happen unless we connect what the assessment does with the learning that happens in the classroom. And so with that, I want to just dig in with our panel, and let me introduce my colleagues here. Jim Popham, starting on my right here, is a professor emeritus at UCLA and has decades of experience that he's going to share with us today. Allison Timberlake is the Deputy Superintendent of Assessment and Accountability at the Georgia Department of Education. Michael Sibley is the Director of Communications at the Alabama Department of Education. And Penny Schwinn is the Deputy Commissioner for Academics at the Texas Department of Education. Please join me in welcoming our panel. So Penny, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you all just to reflect on what I just said and put it in the context of the state that you're in, or the vantage point you've had from working with multiple states, Jim, and just what you see as the landscape of what we see today. Penny.
Sure. So I think that in Texas, one of the things that we've spent the most amount of time on over the last several years, and I'm going to thank my colleagues who I see in the audience, is really around our student report card. So we've spent a great deal of time thinking about who the end user is of the information, and for so long we spent time trying to communicate data files to districts and not extending that same information to our families. So we reversed that and really put all of our energy into developing a new state report card. It goes down to where a family can log in, see every question on the test, the answer, the rationale for that, and then get links to specific resources to help them with their child. What we've seen as a result of that is an incredible increase in parent understanding of the assessment, investment in the assessment, and we went from 45,000 families who would log on and look. Last year it was 500,000, and this year we've already hit over 1 million in the first 3 weeks. And so we know that there is a real need and interest for this, and that's driven a lot of important conversations in the classroom. It's driven important conversations at the site level. So I think it really speaks to how we're thinking about the work as it relates to parents and educators as partners.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Those numbers speak volumes for what people want to know, and when you make it accessible. So, Michael.
Well, we know that we want in Alabama assessments that are consistent and that are aligned with our courses of study. I'm a communications person, so I'm a little different from a lot of the psychometricians and researchers and all the highly intelligent people in this room, obviously. I feel honored to be in your presence. I'm thinking maybe through osmosis some of it will just rub off on me. But in Alabama, messaging is extremely important. And it's, as Penny said, messaging to parents and families and communities, but also to the people who pull the purse strings. Not that they're not always one and the same, but our legislators and our board members, making sure, because they, just like most people in the general public, have to have it explained to them in a way that makes sense and in a way that they understand, so they can see, regardless of where we fall on the spectrum, where we are, so that we can make plans to move forward. Our assessments right now in Alabama, we're in a unique situation because we're in a gray area. We have had an assessment that was recently pulled off the table. Right now we're kind of in between. In fact, just yesterday we had 3 assessment providers come to our state board, and they're making a decision as to what we're going to use going forward. Over the next couple of years, we're using a Scantron, but that's sort of a stopgap measure until we determine what our assessment is. So what we want to do more than anything else is develop some consistency to make a benchmark that we can compare something to, because currently the only longitudinal data we have is NAEP, and NAEP is very, very valuable. But we want that same kind of consistency with our state tests, and until we can develop that and are able to explain to the public, we're going to this point from this point, it's been hopscotch so far, so it's a little difficult to get that message across. Once we develop that consistency, it'll be a lot easier to do that.
Yeah, Michael, let me ask you about that, because we do have some people in the room facing, potentially changing to a different assessment, and you've had quite a bit of experience with the difference between one test to the next to the next. Mm-hmm. Do you have advice for those in the room about how do you communicate that so effectively to help people understand why you're moving to a new test and what that actually means?
Well, you have to consider the end source, where people get their information from. Largely, at least in our state, people get it from the news media and what they read online, but mostly it's the news media. So we make sure, my team and I make sure that we have sort of a private press conference, if you will, with our media people ahead of time, so that we can explain to them, this is what this means. Assessments are already, for the average person, a little difficult to understand. So if you put a message out there that's inaccurate, you can't unring that bell. So you'll spend all your time trying to clear up what you said earlier. So we make sure that we have a pre-session with our media so that we can explain to them, this is this and this is not this, so that they can get a handle on that. And we make sure that we send correspondences and toolkits to our local school districts that lay out ways that they can explain everything from sample letters and op-ed pieces and things that they can provide to their parents to get some clarity in that, because it is, for those of us who aren't as smart as assessment folks, it's a difficult subject to grasp.
Is it fair to say that if you're thinking about audiences, because there is no such thing as a general public audience, there is always a specific audience, it's fair to say that that audience has a vested interest in what's going to happen in their space, and that communicating that matters deeply. So teachers is a different audience than parents, than legislators, and really need to be thinking about that.
Right.
Okay. Allison, tell us about Georgia.
Yeah, so in Georgia, we've seen a tremendous shift in how we approach assessment in our state over the last couple of years. 4 years ago, we had kind of the Lake Woebegone approach to assessment. We had a pretty basic assessment system. It was all multiple choice. Practically every student was proficient, and it just didn't provide detailed information that parents, educators, or anyone could really use to improve student learning and move students forward. We also had a set of assessments that weren't cohesive. They didn't send a similar signal across grades or content areas. It was kind of like each assessment was just built to satisfy a mandate or a requirement, and it wasn't a really thoughtful process. Well, over the course of the last 4 years, we've tried to move away from that. We've tried to build a cohesive assessment system, one that's more rigorous. We use more authentic item types like constructed response and technology enhanced, to provide better measures of student learning and a similar signal across the grade levels.
Jim, got some decades of experience here. What do you see?
Well, I was here yesterday, as many members of the audience were, for lunch. The food was free, and I had a big takeaway from that session, and it was you, Carissa. You started off with a preamble to the introduction of the speaker with a statement you wanted to see more activity that would lead to the better education of all children. And you closed out the session with the same thing. I haven't heard that kind of view expressed from the big cheese at CCSSO previously, and here you are, a new person, pushing in what I hope is a terrific direction. Let me tell you, we have three basic purposes of educational tests. One is to compare test takers, for example, to see who gets into a prestigious university or who gets assigned to a remedial program. In fixed quota settings, comparative tests are fine. We have another purpose, which is to evaluate the caliber of instruction. Clearly, that's relevant to your mission. Good programs get applauded, less good programs get fixed. And finally, we have the contribution to instruction. My belief is that in this country right now, The kinds of tests that are represented in the audience are not doing the latter two jobs well at all. A key tenet in the educational and psychological testing standards revised in 2014, and important because they influence court decisions. A key tenet is the most important thing in our field is assessment validity. And assessment validity is present when you can make accurate interpretations of what a student's score means, and when that interpretation is consonant with the purpose for which the test is being used. Now, we have tests that are being used for evaluation of schools and teachers, and we have tests that are being used supposedly to improve the caliber of kid learning. We have very little evidence that those latter two phenomena are properly addressed.
So let's dig into that a little bit. What kind of advice would you have for the folks in the audience about what they need to do to make that connection between instruction? What should this group be doing?
Well, the first thing you should do is insist on purpose-relevant evidence. Insist that if a test is ostensibly to be used to improve instruction, where is the evidence that that test does in fact make a contribution to the decisions that teachers make? Or once those decisions have been made, to improve the caliber of kid learning. In very few instances do we see that kind of evidence supplied. We tend to be worshiping at the altar of alignment. If it's alignment, oh, we have a wonderful test. No, we don't. If there are no actionable implications flowing from that alignment, either to evaluate the school accurately or to improve the caliber of instruction, then we have a test that is not all that wonderful.
Okay. Well, you already got applause, man.
Try to beat that, you guys.
All right, we're going to keep moving on. So Penny, I want you to talk just a little bit about, we talked with Michael about kind of the stakeholder engagement and the pieces that are important to, and Michael, I resonate with your comment about, like, we're in a room full of incredibly smart people, but I would also say that our communications directors are a critical part in being able to communicate that really important information, and it's a team effort. I always saw my communications director as somebody who I could rely on to help de-wonk whatever it was that I was going to say and make it actually knowledgeable. So, Penny, talk to us a little bit about this local school board training you guys have enacted. I'm really interested in that, how it's impacting assessment and the results, and then maybe even school improvement efforts. Just give us a little bit of context on that.
Sure. So some context in Texas is that one of the big endeavors from this commissioner and our team is around making sure that we've identified all of the decision makers and influencers as it relates to improving our lowest performing schools. And so one of the big influencers are our local school boards, and we have over 1,200 of them in the state of Texas. So what we thought about was that there was a lot of misinformation or unclear information related to the assessment, which funnels into how we determine who our lowest performing schools are. And so one of the ways that we could leverage the work of the state is to engage directly with our school board members to help them understand more about the assessment, why it measures student learning, and then what they can do to support student learning at the local level. So we started something called Lone Star Governance, and Lone Star Governance is a training that school boards go through. It has a rubric, but it really tries to refocus school boards from what ends up being a lot of discussion on local politics towards student achievement, how we measure it, and how we can improve it. So school boards will go through that training on a regular basis, and then one of the things that we're doing is linking that to our accountability system. And so as we put out our new accountability report card, which is kind of all the conversation lately, we'll have distinctions on the bottom. And so school boards who have gone through that training and who have shown that they, one, understand our assessment, they understand the link to student achievement and performance, they can get a distinction on the report card that shows that that school board is really focused in I think, talking about the business of student learning and proficiency and achievement, as opposed to some of the other topics that we often see on school board agendas.
So it's pretty early in the program, but have you seen any outcomes from some of those districts that have gone through that already, and any evidence that you can see that maybe is changing some of their practices?
Sure, so the measurement of that can be really tricky. One of the things that we're using to measure that is literally the percent of time that school boards spend talking about student achievement at their board meetings as opposed to other topics that may come up. And so I think in that respect, those school board members who have elected to go through that level of training and support from the state have seen a pretty significant shift in how they're spending their time at the school board meetings. We haven't been able to link that then to spending decisions or allocations, and then to student achievement. We'll see some early data on that this year. But for those board members who have gone through that training, what we have seen is that the types of questions that they're asking, the conversations that we're having as it relates to school turnaround and our improvement required campuses has shifted to talking about children and students and their learning, and not only around sanctions. And so that in itself is a pretty massive shift when you think about the scale of a state the size of Texas.
Yeah. So, Allison, I want to ask you about the innovative assessment pilot. We know that there are states taking the lead and being innovative in how they assess students, and we've heard Georgia is developing this game-based formative assessment for grades 1 and 2. Tell us about that. Tell us what's going on in there.
We are, yeah. So we've spent a lot of time in our state talking about the summative assessment system, and I'm sure there's not an assessment director in the state that hasn't been charged with developing a 30-minute assessment that measures 4 content areas, 27 domains, releases items, instantaneous results, and at a bargain price. But we know that our summative assessment systems can't do all of the things that our stakeholders are demanding and needing of them. In particular, in Georgia, like many states, we have a focus on K-5 literacy and ensuring that students are reading on grade level by 3rd grade in particular. And so since all of our summative assessments have traditionally started at grade 3, there was a real need for something formative in grades 1 and 2. Well, that begs the question, how do you do something in a meaningful way that's developmentally appropriate for this population of students? So we headed down the path of game-based assessments, and we're developing what's called Keenville. It's a game-based assessment. Students enter the world of Keenville and help Keen solve challenges, and it's not only developmentally appropriate, but it's fun and engaging for the students. It's kind of a safe environment where they can approach these challenges, and we can assess their literacy and math skills without them feeling like they're taking a test. And
this is being collected at the state level then, the results from that? Is that right?
It is. So it's a state level opportunity. It's not required. Districts can choose to use it. But just as an example of the excitement, we had a pilot this past spring, and we had over 100 of our 180 school districts volunteer to participate in the pilot.
It's not really a pilot. That's like most of your districts, right? But that's a good thing when it's not required. So that's fantastic, and we'll look to see more of what happens with that. Michael, I want to come back to you, and we're shifting a little bit from assessment to the accountability piece of this, but Alabama unveiled its first A through F report card this year. And talk to us about how you prepared to communicate, use toolkits with local systems, I mean, because you got to help districts explain that as well, and just maybe some communication tips on accountability systems, because you're not the only ones that put out a new accountability system. Some people may have had new nuances to it, but give us some advice on that.
All right, first you have to understand the context of where we are in Alabama, and some of these are self-inflicted wounds. So there are 3 things to keep in mind. One, we have a new state report card, A through F report card. So the schools that are failing get Fs. With that, we have a state law called the Alabama Accountability Act, which requires us to identify the 6 lowest performing schools and identify them as failing. It's literally in the law as failing. So that's 2 sets of failing schools. Currently, the state capitals, Montgomery, and the local school system, Montgomery Public Schools, is under intervention. We kind of played musical chairs with superintendents recently. Our 2 superintendents ago, when he took over the school system, intervened, called it a bifurcated intervention process, split it in half, and identified the schools that weren't doing well and labeled them as failing. Now, the 3 groups of schools in each of these assessments aren't all the same, if that's not confusing enough. So it's a failings.
So say that part again. These 3 sets of schools are not the same in the way
not the same. The bottom 5% aren't necessarily the same schools that get Fs on the state report card.
Okay.
So it's possible that you can get an F in one area and not get an F in the other two, or get an F in all three, or any combination of that. So that in and of itself is really, really difficult to explain to the average person, because it just sounds like, what are you guys doing? One was a state law that we had no control over. The other was a process put in place by a former superintendent that we're trying to rectify now, but you can't unring that bell again, so people still identify certain schools as failing. One of the things that we did to try to get the message out to our LEAs and to other people, we developed a toolkit. A lot of people do that, in that we had all the basic things, a glossary with layman terms so people can understand what this and that means, some commonly asked questions. We identified questions that we expected to be asked, questions that we wanted to be asked, and questions that we prayed no one would ever ask. And develop answers.
We all have that list, actually.
Yeah.
So.
We developed answers to all three, and put together some other support, some fact sheets for media, for parents, for teachers, because they're not always the same. And we also came up with some suggested social media posts that LEAs could use to explain things. We put all this together and then had a statewide webinar, and of course it took the support of our interim state superintendent at the time. Pulled all that together. We had great success having, there are 137 school systems in the state of Alabama. We had about 125 people on the webinar, which was a pretty good success. It lasted about an hour and a half, and we went through everything from the history of the report card and why it was important, ways that you might be able to differentiate to your publics the difference between this F and this F and this F. Outside of the city of Montgomery, it's not as complicated because there are only two Fs, two groups of schools that get Fs. But we did everything from a sample press release that they could give to their immediate publics, and tried to explain to them, it's a difficult task no matter how you do it, but try to explain to them the difference in the three. And most recently, we've been asking our legislators to, at the next session, consider revisiting the law that calls for the bottom 6% to be identified as failing schools. The problem is that is connected to a voucher system that's established in the state, and there's other concerns involved with that. So it's difficult in any situation. It's particularly difficult in Alabama, and we're working as best we can to the problem is when you have the bottom 6%, it doesn't matter. You're always going to have a bottom 6%, so there's always going to be something listed as failing schools.
Right.
We're trying to, hopefully they'll get away from that and do a better job at explaining to schools and school systems how to differentiate.
Yeah, and I want to tie that back to where we started, which was like the purpose of an accountability system is to make identifications to thereby then make change to improve instruction for kids, right? And so, like on the face, those three areas that you just described, they may be all perfectly legitimate ways in which to make decisions, but are they leading to those conversations to then improve instruction for kids? So you probably would give advice to the audience that maybe don't have three ways to get to an F.
I hope no one else has to deal with that issue, because the question is, once a school system or a school receives an F, now what? One of the questions that we weren't really prepared to answer, so it fell under one of the questions we hope they don't ask, is, okay, my school's an F school. What are you going to do about it? How does that, what decision does that make in terms of funds? Will my school receive this, that, or the other, depending on what letter grade they get? And there's also the issue of people who say, my school's not a failing school. If the bottom 6% are identified as a failing school, and your kid's school didn't make the cut by this much, and they're just relieved, my school's not failing. Well, depends on how you look at that.
Yeah, right. Let me ask the audience, for show of hands, how many of you feel like you're prepared to answer when you've identified that bottom tier of schools, or the comprehensive support or the targeted support, that you're able to answer the question, what does that mean for that school? How many of you feel like you've got that figured out? So look around, those people with their hands up. Yeah, we need to get you up here as well. So I think that's a struggle, and it's something that we definitely need to lean in on. So Jim, let's talk a little bit about, back to the student learning piece of this, and your thought on how we should be assessing students to ensure they're learning what they're expected to learn, how end-of-year assessments can more closely relate to student learning.
Well, yeah, I'll answer that, Carissa, but I decided, by the way, based on your push for more impact on kid learning, to call that Carissa's Quest. It's alliteration by using different letters, and that's the best kind. I want to go back to...
I will own that, thank you. I
okay.
like that. Okay.
I want to go back to something Allison said about, because it kind of triggers my response to your question. You indicated that in many instances, people wanted more than you could supply. Well, that is a clear example of people not knowing what's sensible to ask for. I've been in this field for longer than most of you. I mean, I was attending the large-scale assessment conferences when they were barely building the mountains in Colorado. It's a long, long while. and I've seen a lot of tries. I've made a few myself that haven't worked out all that well. I am convinced now that the single most cost-effective way to improve our schools, to satisfy Carissa's quest, is to engage in expanding the assessment literacy of various concerned clienteles, folks who have a stake in the schools. And when I'm talking about assessment literacy, I'm not talking about a plethora of psychometric stuff. I'm talking about a very small number of key constructs, validity, reliability, fair use of tests, and so on. And if that could happen, then fewer mistakes would be made. I guess I was triggered by your point, because I think we've allowed ourselves to get in a terrible, untenable position by having people say, I want this, I want kids to learn that, I want kids to learn that. And as a consequence, we have too damn many things to teach in the time available, too many things to measure sensibly in the time available. Measure for the purposes of instruction. How can you measure when you have one or two items indicating whether a student has mastered a skill or a body of knowledge? In other words, we have allowed all that to happen because we haven't pushed back on what can be done. We can do a reasonable job, a powerful job in exactly what you want if we have sensible targets, a small number of targets, the most important targets, have the guts to prioritize. We can do that, but we can do that with an audience that, if it's assessment literate, will be easier to persuade.
So Jim, we were talking backstage about how long you've been in this business. How long have you been in this business? When was that the Colorado Mountains being built? That was what, 48 years ago?
Yeah, I've been around a while. This next year I'll attend my 60th straight session of the American Educational Research Association, since I was a graduate student way back at Indiana University. Yeah, I've watched the whole works. I really have, and I've made tons of mistakes. One of the things you alerted us to in advance, we ought to think about the mistakes we've made in our careers, and boy, that was easy for me because I had quite a large selection option. and I think actually the one thing I have learned that is relevant to the assessment literacy push is you have to go for a manageable number of foci. I took a lot of Latin in high school and college, and I try to use the Latin plural when I can. You have to have a modest number of foci. And to illustrate, the first big mistake I ever made of that sort is when I was a proponent of behavioral objectives. Very few of you can remember those. These are very precisely stated instructional objectives, how the student would behave after instruction was over, and then based on that, you decide to do what to do next. Okay, all that made good sense. I made the mistake of thinking that the more specific an objective would be, the more useful it would be to a teacher in deciding what to do next. And so I was pushing specificity. We ended up with hundreds and hundreds of behavioral objectives distributed throughout the U.S. They were widely used and so on. Well, I asked a colleague who's out in the public schools from Riverside to come in and lecture to my classes. I did that a lot. And she said, Jim, would you take me to the Instructional Objectives Exchange? Because that's where we had all these things housed. And it was right on the way to UCLA. And so I took her up. And the instructional objectives exchange was in a building which was on fire. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen instructional objectives burning, but it can be quite exhilarating. And the truth is, I saw them going up, and I wish they would have all gone up in smoke. As a matter of fact, just half of them did, and we had a fire sale. But the truth is, I learned then, you can't be focused on too many damn things. And whether it's curriculum, and you isolate the things that are most important, yay for you. If you try to cover it all, you can't do it. If you try to measure all the stuff, yay for you, you can't do it. And so as a consequence, my big lesson, a long career, a lot of mistakes, is you have to go for the manageable, achievable notions, and that is true whether it's assessment literacy or measuring anything.
Thank you. I want to give our other panelists a chance to reflect on that, the manageable, achievable. Allison, if you want to take a shot at that, because you talked about what you did to kind of scale back the expectations on the innovative assessment, but have any of you been able to do that, to be able to do what Jim's talking about?
Effectively, no. And as Jim was talking, when you work in assessment and accountability, you live at the intersection of controversy and drama, right? It doesn't matter what we do, it's going to be the wrong
controversy
thing.
and trauma, is that what you're saying?
Drama, yeah. Yeah, we spend our time justifying our existence, right? We're traditionally reactive. We defend what we have and why it works. We fall back on things like validity and reliability and technical quality. But we need to be proactive. Assessment shouldn't be a black box, and the fact that the public and our stakeholders and parents and policymakers think that it is means that we failed. We haven't done the things that Jim's talked about. We haven't built those tools and resources to help them understand what the value of assessment truly is and how to connect it to improved instruction and learning.
Nothing communicates like being there, and again, a person can be highly capable, highly competent, but if they, make their living at the cleaners down the street, they know that well. What they don't know is large assessment issues very well. So, for example, with our A through F report card, what I make a practice of telling people is that most assessments, like the A through F report card, can be seen sort of like cliff notes to a really good novel. But if you want to read the book, go visit that school. Get involved and see the very practical application of the things that students are being taught. Get involved and learn from talking to the people who are in the trenches, teachers who are there all the time. Reading the cliff notes has a certain amount of redeemable value, but there's nothing like getting out there and finding out for yourself.
Penny?
Yeah, I think that part of it, for us in Texas at least, is it's defining the role of the state and how things work together. And so, like, the business of a state agency is you define what students should learn, you measure how much they learned, and then you report on that to the public. And when you separate and it becomes an assessment and accountability structure, and you leave out everything related to standards and curriculum, you've siloed things in such a way that you're communicating to your districts, you should look at the numbers, and teaching and learning is over here. So one of the things that we did, and I'll be honest, it's been really challenging in terms of a change management process, is we said that those are the three big pillars related to student learning. And we actually need to start with standards and instruction. And our standards are voted on by the state board, and they're going through a streamlining process. But we actually took the content components of our assessment design, and we moved that back into curriculum. And I think when we hear the feedback from that group, the most important thing that I've heard in terms of that feedback is our standards group said we had no idea how all of this worked. We would do so many things differently in terms of how they facilitated board conversations, how we made changes to standard streamlining, and how well the people who are developing the assessment understand the content of the assessment and can then communicate that back to our educators and to our districts. And so making sure that we really start with the core of what is it that the standards are saying and how do we measure that, and keeping that rooted in teaching and learning and instruction, and not making it that assessment accountability lives over here, because when you separate those, you've separated the three kind of major tenets of what we do in public education. So it's been a reorg in terms of what we've done in Texas, and I think it's been difficult, but the payoffs that we're starting to see now I think have been pretty strong in terms of how we communicate that to our districts and the types of resources that we're building.
So are you seeing some changes in the standards and some streamlining of the standards that would then lead to those other things?
Yeah, so our standards team really works with the state board to determine and facilitate the process by which the board determines and votes on what the standards should be. But the board really does rely on the state agency to provide that guidance and facilitation. And so when we have a much better understanding of assessment and curriculum together as one cohesive unit, the guidance that we provide to our state board is very, very different. And I think the way that we construct assessment, the way we answer questions, the way that we facilitate and work with our communications team, it all looks different. And so that's been, I think, a really important part. And we've gone from, I think in one, and I see Monica and Shelley out there, so they will tell me when I'm wrong, but one of the things is we had over 100 standards and student expectations for a content area. That's way too many. Of 175 school days, you're not going to get through that. And so the streamlining of that, getting down to no more than 2 or 3 dozen, which is still a lot, is an important part of the work, and we wouldn't know that if we didn't have a much better understanding in the curriculum shop around assessment and the inability to possibly assess all of those.
Let me just add to that, and that's exactly what I'm concerned about. In a sense, we're being dishonest by suggesting to policymakers that we could do all that stuff. And if you had assessment knowledgeable people explaining to them why their children would be better educated at a deeper level with a modest number of things that are most important, as opposed to this pretense of covering the whole damn works, this returns to your concern, how you educate children better.
I think, too, the unintended consequence of having a wide array of standards when we think about the peer review process that your assessments have to go through, and one of those questions being, like, have you actually measured all of those standards, and then the considered misalignment to it if you're not measuring all those standards. So your point is well taken.
Let's talk about the peer review process.
Let's talk about that, because I know you have opinions about that,
Well,
Jim.
because
I bet people in this room have opinions about that, too. So
when NCLB flourished in the land, then we were all happy.
I don't remember that time.
Well, it was a very short moment. It got
Okay.
2 seconds.
All right.
Then ESSA came, and with ESSA more freedom, and we'd have a chance to do better things, except there was peer review again. Now, peer review of a traditional sort means what you're doing is a crackerjack job for purposes of comparison. Tracing back 100 years to the Army Alpha, you can produce those tests that have wonderful internal consistency, reliability coefficients, do all the nifty stuff, but they don't have a damn thing to do with teaching children or judging the quality of schooling. And as a consequence, all that happened in a very significant way. What we have to do is figure out some way to promote greater insights regarding the key fundamentals. It would be wrong to try to promote assessment literacy of too much stuff. It would be right to try to promote assessment literacy tailored to the individual groups. Kids need assessment literacy too. That's going to be different than the one you provide for school districts. But Michael, you do a lot of work with school board members and policymakers, legislators, and so on. It's hard to craft a message in such a way that it's going to grab them. And let me try something with you. You may not agree. I think one of the lessons I've learned is that some people do things because it's good for kids, but many don't. Most people do things because it's good for them. And what you have to do is you have to craft the plan in such a way that it's going to be good for the legislator, at the same time it's good for kids. Can you work that out, and how do you deal with legislators in those circumstances?
As a matter of fact, one of the things that I try most to do, and I think that we can certainly do a better job at, is having regular communication with legislators when the session is not in. When the session is in, they're being bombarded with all kinds of information. I want to make sure that we get messages outside of the regular newsletters and things of that such to legislators during the off season, so that it remains a priority in their mind. One of the things that my team and I came up with, we have a thing called Review the Standards, and on our website we have every standard from K through 12, and you can go through and look at every standard. And if you like the standard, you can indicate that you like it. If you don't like it, you think it should be in a different area or in a different grade, you can indicate that and then explain why. And probably a year and a half or so ago, not this past, but the legislative session prior, we challenged every lawmaker to examine the standards, look at it, tell us what you think. Don't just go on constituents saying X, Y, Z. Look, if you have a grandchild, or if you have a child, or if you went to public school, if you care at all, examine our standards, look through them before you say you don't like them, because there's a lot of politics involved in that too, and indicate to us which ones you don't feel are appropriate and why. And then when you do that, you put the onus on them to take a look at it and let you know. Most won't. We had very, well,
What was your uptake on that? I'm curious.
we had some participation, but not much. When they did, they had the option. You know, we leave it up to them to be honest with us. It's that kind of thing. So they have an option to say when they first open that page up, are you a parent? Are you a legislator? Are you an educator? What section do you fall in? And we had some participation, but it was not wildly successful.
Let me just follow up on that. A little difference in the same approach would be not to let them choose whether they thought it was okay or not okay, but you guys decide, educators decide, we can only accomplish about 25. You pick the top 25. Prioritize. Make it have the guts to prioritize, because otherwise they'll say, yeah, that's good, that's good. It's a wish list. And what you have to do is you have to force people to say, we can't do it all. These are the things we must do. And that makes a difference, I think. You try that one time and see if you come up with something different.
It does. Trying to consolidate that 25 would be a task if someone could do that.
Well, yeah, but that's okay. But let's say you have a fair number of people who come up with somewhat similar 25. Then you're off and running. At least you're in the direction of what you want to be. The other approach, I submit, I've tried it. Didn't work.
So I do remember a movement of power standards at one time, where it was like doing just what you just said, which was picking the highest level standards. But then, we continued to test things that were not the power standards. There were things underneath it, and so people had to be forced to.
Well, that's because in part the peer review, as you said,
right,
that test them all. And so, I mean, you have to have a critical mass of people, those in the room, the testing companies, and wise, smart educators who say, we can't do it all. And when you can't do it all, you have to have the courage to say, these are the ones that are most important, and follow through with it. We didn't follow through with those well enough.
Yeah. Maybe we need to have a building fire to put the standards in there and have a building fire.
That might help. I have several in mind.
Okay, we'll come back to that. I'm going to ask that there are cards on the table, I believe. So you're going to be able to write out any questions you'd like to ask this panel, and we'll have people floating around. I'll probably give you another 5 to 7 minutes or so to do that. You just hold them up, and our staff will come around and get them from you, and then we'll do that. So, Penny, I want to come to you. You have an interesting vantage point, having worked in California, Delaware, and Texas. You've seen, you've done your rounds here. Sorry, you make a full circle. You've had an interesting vantage point about the different kinds of reforms and efforts, and in this context of how we inform student learning. Talk to us about that journey and what you saw in those 3 different systems. So.
Yeah, it's been interesting. In California, it was just moving from a state assessment perspective, from local state to consortia, kind of doing that in Delaware, and then Texas, certainly not. I want to get that on the record since we're on video. We are our own state, our own country. But I think as a recovering Californian. So I think that one of the things that's coming full circle is there was a big push 5 or 6 years ago around local accountability systems, and we're starting to see that come back pretty aggressively. And in Texas, part of our accountability system is if you get it, we are moving to A through F, so appreciate the advice. We're taking some notes over here. But if you get an A, B, or C on our state assessment, you can have a local accountability system that can be approved. And it's this need to kind of push to the local level to personalize as much as possible at the state and then down to our local districts. And so that's been something that I think in Sacramento, we were working on a local system. In Delaware, which is 130,000 students for the state, we really did a lot of work at the local level with our 19 school districts to figure out what is personalized in Delaware specific. And in Texas, we're trying to push that same thing out to all 1,200 plus districts to give them that voice. But I think one of the things, and just to go back to a comment that was made earlier, is just it's behavioral. So when you have so many standards, and we're seeing a shift to streamline that, it is incentivizing our districts to spend a lot of time looking to see which part of which standard was tested and the pattern, and they're spending so much time in capital trying to figure out what could be on the test next, and so then let's teach that, and not really thinking about how are we teaching standards comprehensively. And I don't think that that's a pattern that's different whether you're in California, Delaware, or Texas. But in terms of things that I think have been positive in shifts, it's been really personalizing and local, driving kind of those local decisions as it relates to accountability and to our assessment system.
Yeah. So Allison, I want to ask you to think about, in your role, what you're going to be thinking about for the next 5 years, what you might advise your fellow assessment directors to be thinking about, and that under ESSA, because we're going to have ESSA, we're going to have this opportunity. It's a real opportunity for states, but it's a huge responsibility too, because we can no longer say U.S. Department of Ed made us do it. We've got a wide open a space here. So talk to us about that.
You're right. I think there's a lot of opportunities under ESSA, both in terms of assessment and accountability, but with assessment in particular, just because there are flexibilities, people need to be cautious not to pursue flexibility just because we can. States really need to engage in serious conversations with a wide audience of stakeholders and have those conversations about the future of assessment in your state. What is it that you want to know about student learning and performance, and what's the best system of assessments and resources to help you answer those questions?
Michael, how about you, 5 years from now? What do you see?
We just want consistency in the state of Alabama. We're hoping to have an assessment that we can, right now, whenever there's a churn in state assessment, NAEP picks up an interest, particularly with our legislators, and we, fortunately, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the governing board had one of its quarterly meetings in the city of Montgomery recently. That, along with our new state superintendent being one that puts a high priority on NAEP and has explained to me recently that NAEP will be included in our next strategic plan, or having some kind of vision on how we perform on NAEP is going to be included in the state's strategic plan. These are things that we're hoping over the next 5 years we'll realize, and again, starting now, actually we started our sort of a stopgap measure assessment last year, and we're going to do it again this year. We're hoping over the next few years to have that established. We want to see that consistency and literally be able to, with some certainty, tell our parents and communities our kids are making this much progress, or even if it's not progress, we're going backwards this much, but we need a baseline by which we can determine that. So 5 years for us isn't a very long time. We're just hoping to get our land legs on by then and be stable.
And you serve on the NAEP Advisory Task Force, is that right?
I do. I serve on the NAEP Advisory Council. It's a pleasure to be able to do that. NAEP has for a long time been something that our educators, legislators, and other people just did not pay that much attention to. They knew of it, but again, that churn in our local assessment doesn't give us anything with any longitudinal data, so NAEP becomes that much more important then. So now we have, for the first time, I've been with the State Department 14 years. It's the first time I've heard people talking actively about NAEP performance. So it's ramping up in terms of its relevance in our state.
Jim, you want to get in here?
Yeah, I did want to. Anytime I hear conversation about NAEP playing a role in the evaluation of anything, I get terrified. I finished last August 8 years as a member of the National Assessment Governing Board. So we set policy for NAEP. And this is a test not designed to help you know whether someone has done well or badly instructionally. It just doesn't have any evidence that it's useful for that purpose. It is absolutely dysfunctional for telling you who the goods and the bads are. And any time you find that kind of a test being proffered for use in an accountability system, it suggests to me that assessment literacy is not prevalent in the land. People just don't understand that. And that's exactly one of the kinds of things that I think we need to address in a hurry. It's not just NAEP, it's other kinds of tests that, look, when the new standards say to us, you have to have evidence, you build with an argument based on evidence that the test is suitable for a given purpose. Where is the evidence that many of the tests we are currently using right now to judge our schools, to convey to the public that these are the good data that you must attend to, where's there any evidence that they're useful for that purpose, that they can distinguish between a kid who was taught well and a kid who was not taught well? So I hear NAEP mentioned and I get sick.
See, here's the issue with that, though. When you have the people who hold the purse strings who are looking at NAEP performance as some indication as to whether they'll support this program or support that program, it feeds into your point, I see.
That's assessment of literacy at its worst. I mean, you're right. They're not trying to do bad stuff. They think it's a good thing to do. And I never fault people for using whatever information they have to try to improve education for kids. But in the case of NAEP, it's just the wrong test. And once they understood that, then they could look for more appropriate measures.
But I do think too, Jim, I don't think any state is using NAEP in their accountability system. Because it's a yearly thing, you would have, like,
It's
so
an
you're not
indicator.
using it. It's
one of
more
the
about
indicators in the
information.
report card, but it's not.
Yeah, yeah. So Penny, I want to give you a chance to reflect on what the next 5 years looks like and what you might see on the horizon.
Yeah, so I think we're going to double down on making sure that we're communicating effectively. And I think a lot of it goes down to communication and making sure that people understand the link between curriculum and assessment. So we're spending a lot of capital developing what we call our standards are called our TEKS, but our TEKS guide to make sure that people understand what is it the standard, how does the assessment actually measure that standard or student expectations so that there's really clear alignment between what is taught and what is tested, and then from there taking a really critical look. We're doing focus groups around the state, and we will continue to do so to report back on how that factors into accountability and the types of supports, technical assistance, and interventions that will occur as a result. So really trying to be very articulate and very clear in how we define what that stream of learning looks like, how they're all connected, and then adjusting and supporting our districts to do the same at the local level. So trying to make that continuum a lot more explicit than it is now.
We got some great questions here, and we've only got 20-some minutes to get through them. So I'm gonna start to run through this. I love this. Someone's already taking the moniker of Carissa's Quest and using it in a question. So thank you, Jim, for that. So how much instructional information should we expect from a summative test? Is the real promise of useful information to help Carissa's Quest from formative assessment practices? Fascinating question. You want to try it?
Damn little instructional information from a summative test. You can't measure with the level of precision necessary for a teacher to make sensible decisions about a kid based on what is provided. But what you do is you build the summative test with the thoroughgoing anticipation that there must be a family of other tests that go with it that are indeed focused on something that a teacher can make sense of instructionally, that a parent can make sense of instructionally, that a kid can make sense of instructionally. So you don't get it from the summative test, but you craft the summative test from the get-go to yield sensible stuff at a lower level.
Anybody want to add to that? Nobody's going to argue with Jim on that one, right? Okay. All right, this one's for the audience. Let's have a show of hands for Dr. Popham's idea to limit what gets measured. How many people are in favor of that?
Let's get those hands up there.
Some people are waving their hands. I think that's double votes. Yeah. Let's see. Michael, I think this one's for you. If you could teach a legislator 3 points about assessment, what would they be? And it says beyond reliability and validity.
Beyond.
Reliability and validity. I don't think I would even teach them reliability and validity.
I wouldn't be the one to teach them reliability and validity anyway.
I think that might be a stretch.
I think I would go with the one that I said a little while ago at first. Assessments are a snapshot. They're an indicator, but you will need to visit a school, talk to teachers to get some of the nuance about what's actually going on in public education. To Jim's point, tests only tell us so much. It would be fantastic, I think, if there were a way to have an assessment that was taken every week almost, or something where taking the test wasn't an event, but learning and knowledge of the content is just something that was ongoing all the time, so that you were able to build that up. I talked to them about the fact that it's a snapshot. I talked to them about the fact that they need to get in the schools and see what's going on in the schools, and to make sure that they're enforcing laws and policies that fund schools appropriately. In the state of Alabama, equity is an issue. And people are quick to say it's not about money. I understand that a lot of things aren't about money, but if it weren't the case, folks wouldn't fight for it so hard. There is some inequity in terms of funding, and I would implore that our legislators take a look at that and be reasonable in terms of the very, very rural, very, very poor areas of the state of Alabama anyway, where there's no direct correlation, so I've been told by assessment people, there's no direct correlation with necessarily any other subgroup or any other issue to poor academic performance that stands out more than poverty. There are some really poor parts of the state of Alabama, and I would ask for our legislators to be mindful of that and not do just what works for their constituents in their part of the state, but what works for the state as a whole, that rising tide floats all boats kind of scenario.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's critically important, and it's a resonant theme for all of us to think about. Allison, this question is for Georgia. What is the purpose of Georgia's K-2 assessment game? I think it's a 1-2, right? Mm-hmm. What data is collected? How will it be used instructionally? What standards were measured? How is it now a formative assessment? So I can go back. Yeah, I think there's like 8 questions for you here. But
yeah. So it's first and second grade, and it focuses on literacy and math. So we identified, use the term power standards. We had educators come in and we identified those main standards, particularly that articulate it well with grade 3, and that's what we're focusing on. It's a series of 30 challenges. And just give you one example, we have a game called river tubing, and there's an ELA and a math version with that. So the kids have their keen and they're on a boat and they're fishing in the river to find pages from a textbook, and then they go help the keens, with their questions. So they had to read the passage or the paragraph and answer the questions. And then the math version of that, the lifeguard needs to put them in appropriate groups to go down the river. So there's the numeracy involved. They have to solve the problems to put the keens together. And so we have interactive dashboards. It'll provide real-time data for teachers. We've tried to make it really user-friendly. So we kind of, my psychometric program manager is here and he cringes every time, but he was trying to be so careful with what we report and how we report it to make sure that decisions were appropriate and useful. But I wanted to open up the data. I just wanted to give more to teachers so they could really dig in and see how their kids were doing. So, it'll have how kids did at domain levels and standard levels, and they can look at how their progress has, done over time, so they can really make good decisions individually at the student level right then and there, whether they need to remediate or accelerate, do flexible groupings. It's designed in such a way that kids could play it for 10, 15, 20 minutes in a center, during other instructions, so it's not a standalone event.
So I'm going to leave it there, and I'll just say you'll be around for a while. If people want to dig in a little more on that and want to ask you more questions, they can definitely do that. So, Jim, there's a series of questions in here about your challenge to streamline standards. So I'm going to kind of give you those. It's the how, right? What's the relationship between priority standards, streamlining, and learning progressions? That's one. The matrix sampling to school testing standards problem, and maybe what's the best grain size for a top 25 of standards, federal, state, or district, or how do you go about that? And then coming for state folks.
It's enough.
State folks after this. State folks after this, so after he gives you that challenge, what are the risks involved in that? So how do you do it? How do you get to the top 25? How do you make that a priority?
First, you have to have the awareness that what we're doing now is fraudulent. We're allowing the image.
That's not a tough nut to crack
Hang
at
on,
all.
that's the phase you have to start. You have to start with the notion that what we're doing is allowing the public to believe that these tests that we are producing dominantly on the basis of comparison are suitable for instruction and suitable for evaluation. You have to start with that. Once you start with that, you say, then what can we do? And what I do is I'd always rely on educators, people who are in the classroom and say, hey, look at all that content. Hell, I could teach this, but I couldn't teach all that. I would rely on them. I'd let them make the call. The grain size would be theirs to decide. Now, once they've decided, I would sure as the devil verify that the information coming from the test. You also want to look at the report. The report is the way. You look at the report and you know what you got. If the report, in fact, yields information that is actionable by me as a teacher, hey, I'm halfway there. That's the way you do it. You do it with real teachers trying to make judgments consonant with the purpose, whether it's evaluative or whether it's instructional, and defer to those teachers. And if it doesn't work out, you change it. It's doable. Honestly, it is.
Okay. So I'm going to ask our state folks, what are some of the risks involved in going down that path from a policy level, from working with state boards, for example, or even conveying that to the public? What are some of the risks that you see, and how might you mitigate that?
The risk with telling people basically the stuff that we're doing now is
Too much?
I can't put it as eloquently as Jim did, but telling them that it's too much. Well, sometimes it's not the message, it's the messenger. You would have to get a person that has all kind of credibility to come and make that case, because for every person that says that, there'll be 2 or 3 that say something contrary to that. So the main thing would be getting the right person to come and deliver that message in a way that's convincing enough that the powers that be would adhere to it, because I don't know who that individual would be in our state, but there are too many people with too many irons in the fire around assessments as they are to convincingly make that change.
Michael, but you wouldn't necessarily have to focus on that which is no longer addressed. You focus on these as the ones that have withstood this scrutiny by the teachers and by the parents. And here are these in other words, your field is communication. You have to craft the message in such a way that it will be acceptable, because it's no fun admitting we were wrong. I've had to do it many times in my life. And so what you want to do is you want to do it in a way that is as clever as you possibly can be. And I think you can do it.
I do think your point about the messenger really matters, because it's the people that are going to resonate with whomever that audience is, right? Mm-hmm. And can talk that language and bring that up. Penny, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I feel like there's 2 challenges that I can see that haven't come up, and one is it's the framing, that it's not about winners and losers. When you're streamlining, it means you're taking something away, or you're compacting it, and there's surely going to be a group, large or small, who feels an emotional, strong connection to having that one person specifically listed in the standard, or to ensure that one kind of small part of how something is taught even, that prescription is there. And so removing kind of the adult-centered preferences and not framing it as, well, I got what I wanted and you didn't, and actually thinking about what is it at the end of 3rd grade, at the end of 6th grade, we want our children to know and be able to do. What is that? I think is the first big challenge. And I think that the second is communicating that to educators. If you have a smaller number of standards to teach, then different educators might teach that in different ways, and the assessment might support one way of teaching over another. And so we have to be really cognizant about how do we then provide information and support our educators to understand what it is we are trying to measure, what the way we will measure it, and then what is the support they can get, and to ensure that what they're doing in the classroom actually resonates, and that what their children can do in front of them every single day is what they show on the assessment. So I think that those are 2 pretty significant ones.
Back to this point about where it starts and where the best grain size is for this, I would push us to think about the state. It is hard to reel back once we've had so many. It's much easier to add things than it is to decide what to take away, right? But the state has always said, this is the baseline. Districts can always go above and beyond or do more. And so, at the state level, I think that's probably the grain size to that point. Allison, did you want to weigh in on this one, or?
Yeah, just quickly, I think these kinds of things are most successful when it's a grassroots effort. When you have teachers and educators and schools and districts standing up and saying, look, we need to talk about this, we need to do it differently. They're the ones in the classrooms. They're the ones that see that direct impact on student learning and have the best gauge for what's working and what's not. It's hard for us to just sit at the state level and say, oh, we think this new policy is going to work. They need to step up and tell us what will work better.
Yeah. All right. Let's see.
While you're just looking, your point, Carissa, about emphasizing that other things can be treated at the local level, discretion is available. What you do then is you put a lot of stress on efficiency in promoting student mastery of the high import outcomes. That's why you do it. And then you also supply some other stuff, attractive ways to get them. So you're right, Penny. Some people will be offended. Yeah, that's the way it is. Tough luck. You've been fooled all this while, and here's the truth.
Okay, yes. This is a question for our state folks. Are you doing any ongoing professional learning on assessment literacy? Some of the work you guys are doing in your states.
Yeah, so we have a series of modules called FIP, Formative Instructional Practices, and this was one of the great things we were able to do with our Race to the Top funds. And so it's a series of modules. Educators can either do it online or they can do it in their regions through communities of practice, and those have been really helpful. They don't focus necessarily on our specific state assessment system, but just formative practice in general and how they can use that with their students to improve their instruction. And one of the neat things about that, it's not just active teachers, it's in our preparation programs and all over, so teachers can be thinking about how to incorporate that.
So this is a fun one. This one is, what would you say is the #1 pro and #1 con of the following things? And I'm going to let you all pick which one you want to do. No Child Left Behind, Common Core, and ESSA. Penny's like, I'm out on Common Core. There's nothing I got to say about that. So, #1 pro, #1 con. You guys can pick whatever one you want to.
And what was the first one?
No Child Left Behind.
I would say that the #1 pro for No Child Left Behind is that it allowed subgroups to be broken out so that people didn't get lost in the averages. You got to see the individual performance of subgroup students in a way that we had not previously. I would say the #1 con is expecting that. What was that year? The goal year was it 07? I think it was. Everyone was going to be at 100%. That kind of, to Jim's point, unrealistic expectation that everyone's going to get to this magic place at one time, and you know, the smartest of us knew that that was not attainable.
Yeah.
Well, No Child did one thing wonderfully well. It focused attention on subgroups in a way that we previously hadn't paid attention to them, and that was a good thing. The problem, the terrible missed opportunity of No Child Left Behind it was implemented by assessment ignorant people, by people who didn't realize that in creating the very kinds of tests that were created in No Child Left Behind, we were doing the opposite from what they wanted to do. They didn't know how to produce tests that could help kids learn. They didn't know how to produce tests that could accurately evaluate the quality of schooling, but they were doable. And that's why I really plead with you to look hard at assessment literacy as the most cost-effective way to improve our schools, that is, to attain Clarissa's quest.
Anybody else want to take a shot at this? #1 pro and #1 con of any one of those?
Yeah, you know, I'll say one of the nice pros with ESSA is this emphasis on the whole child. With No Child Left Behind and that narrow focus on reading and math, we saw what that did to curriculum and instruction and what student learning looked like. But while there's still strict assessment and accountability requirements with ESSA, there is this broader acknowledgement of the importance of the whole child, and you kind of see that play across ESSA, whether it's accountability systems or school improvement or the additional flexibility we have with how we spend our funds.
And you all have built that into your accountability system. Can you talk about some of those other characteristics that are in your accountability system that you think make it a wider view that help in that way?
We have, yeah. I mean, we still have all the test scores and that kind of stuff, but we look at things like access to courses beyond the traditional academic core and pathway completion and accelerated enrollment opportunities and things like that. But we tried to keep it high level and focus on those main opportunities and outcomes because we wanted our schools and districts to still have that flexibility to determine the best way to educate their students.
I want to throw one other quick thing in there about ESSA. Alabama is a state that has a large military presence, and the fact that students of parents in the military, as well as foster children and students who were in juvenile justice systems were broken out as subgroups is, I think, a pro of one of the many pros of ESSA. I don't have any cons yet.
Okay.
Hope I don't.
Yeah. Penny, you got any?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar to what's been said, but I do think that ESSA gives us the opportunity as states to be able to really think about what does innovation look like. We're able to personalize a little bit more than we could ever do under NCLB. And then I think that the con that goes with that is it takes a lot of integrity from a state. I think to your point earlier, we can't hide behind the U.S. Department of Education anymore. And so as states, we have to really say, this is what we stand for. This is what we think is important and critical for all of our students, every population of child, and that we have to think about each and every child holistically. We have to think about schools in a much more holistic way to think about the fabric that makes what a good school is. And that is now defined at the state level. That's no longer defined by the U.S. Department of Education, and how much states are willing to push against that and continue to redefine and put the stakes in the ground and say we are committing to this for our children in our state is really, really difficult to do. And so I'm interested to see how that iterates over time, and how states are able to really establish what they really stand for and their core values as individual states.
I think there's some real opportunities, but some real risks involved if not captured on that. Some of you in the room will remember Roy Truby. You'll remember Roy Truby. He was former state superintendent in Idaho, NAGB governing board, West Virginia chief. Said he taught a graduate class that I took, and he said that No Child Left Behind came about because we didn't step up and take some of the opportunities. And so the pendulum swung pretty heavy to a pretty heavy federal hand. And if you don't step up and take those opportunities and do the things that you need to do for kids, that's what's going to happen. And so we're in that era now where there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of responsibility as well when we think about ESSA. So, I'm going to close us up and give you guys all a final word on this. And I'm thinking about the shift that we talked about yesterday with 36 governors up for re-election, some of them termed out, a tide shift in a lot of state boards. We do have some chief changes that will be coming as well, probably not in Alabama. You guys just got a new chief, so.
I hope not right away.
One of the questions was a few concrete strategies suggest, and it says to change views of governors and legislators. I would modify that to say, how do you work with and help governors and legislators understand how we might actually, at the end of the day, make sure we're making an impact for kids in education? And how do you bring them into it, particularly if you're going to face new leadership or even just people you haven't been working with yet? So. I bet you have some ideas.
I mentioned to Michael before that I think it's so crucial to formulate a digestible, masterable message for legislators that suggests to them that if they are associated with this new thing in assessment, that it will be good for them. Oh, and for the children too. I mean, it takes some cunning to do that, but I don't think legislators are disinterested in children's well-being, but what motivates them is what motivates all of us. I mean, we all want to be good and stuff like that. So I think that's doable. The one thing that I think the group in this room ought to give some serious consideration to is having some impact on the central tenet of the peer review process. The peer review process is supposedly based on standards for education and psychological testing, okay? And what those say is that the most important thing is assessment validity, and what those say is that not only does you have to get an accurate interpretation of what the kid's performance means, but it has to be consistent with the purpose. Now, if we're going to use the test as you want us to improve the caliber of kid learning or to evaluate the schools that aren't doing well, where's the evidence that it's done for that? And the peer review guidance governs what many of you do. And change it. Make them produce evidence of a different purpose. If they want to have tests for one purpose and another, make evidence for any kind of purpose. That's doable. And you guys have the clout to pull that off.
Right. Anybody want to try and follow that?
My marching orders when I leave here are to try to find ways to talk Jim into leaving sunny San Diego and coming to Alabama, where I understand the temperature is about 107 today. So but to your point about we'll call it enticing legislators. I'll look at angles and ways to do that. We try to do that now, and not only entice them for the things that you want them to in terms of persuading them. But sometimes, every now and then, you get lucky like we did in the last legislative session, and we got a pretty healthy education budget. Our governor's a former teacher, it's an election year, that kind of thing. So when it happens, it's also messaging after the fact that we appreciate the funding that we did get, sort of oiling the wheels so that the next time you have to go back and ask for something, you'll everything, all of life is about relationships and building and maintaining relationships, and we'll work at trying to find better ways to do that.
And I would add to that just evidence of what you've spent that money on that aligns to the priorities of the folks that you're talking about. One of the best ways to move someone is to pay close attention to what they say in the media, what they list as some of their top priorities, and then to focus in on how what you are doing and what you want done helps move their priorities and tying it to that. It's going into their office and saying, you want to workforce, for example. We know that a lot of the governor's candidates right now, it's universal, both Republicans and Democrats are saying that they want to create a strong workforce. That's going to require us to have good tests that help us improve instruction. And so you can walk into an office and say, I know you're about workforce, I'm about workforce too, and here's one of the ways in which we're going to do that. So I want to give you guys a chance to say just a final piece of advice for your colleagues in this room and the thing that you're thinking about, and we'll wrap up this session. Go ahead, Penny.
I think that the thing that I'm thinking about coming away from this is really about what our shared belief and commitment is, and whether you talk to a parent or you talk to our governor, we want our children to be happy and healthy and safe. We want them to be successful. So it doesn't matter where in Texas I go or where I grew up in California. That's what I hear from parents, and that's what I hear from our elected officials, and that's what I hear from the people that I work with each and every day. And so I agree that assessment is a way in which we can start to benchmark and measure students' progress towards those ultimate goals that we have for them. And the way that we communicate and bring people into that shared goal, regardless of perspective, is incredibly important.
Assessments are huge, but let's all keep in mind the fact that there are so many other components to public education, the things that aren't measured, the things that can't be quantified, the care, quite frankly, the love that teachers and administrators and everyone else show toward our children every day. We can't make that an indicator on a report card, but it is an extremely crucial part to the whole public education experience.
Thank you.
I'll just echo that we. Very good. You got an applause too. I just echo that we need to build tools and resources to make sure that our assessments are doing their job, which is to actually help improve instruction and student learning.
Because assessment literacy can minimize the number of mistakes we make that harm children, this is an instance in which passivity is impermissible.
So I just want to end where I started with is asking that question, how is what we're doing improving instruction for kids? Keep that at the forefront of what your conversations, and then the rest of the answers for the questions that you pose should be pretty easy. Like if you're always thinking about that, then it's a conversation that you can always have with your chiefs, with your legislators. Like it's got to be about the kids and about making sure that we're improving it, and for all kids, for that matter. So please join me in thanking our panel.
Hey, good job. Good job, really.